thanks all for coming. Happy New Year, happy new decade, 2020. I hope it's off to a good start. I love the opportunity to make introductions at the lecture series. I don't always, but I especially like to make introductions when I have a connection with the speaker, which I do tonight. So I'm very proud to introduce Andria Townsend, who's going to be talking to you tonight, if you already know the topic, on Fishers and Squirrels. And who made the acorn bread? Is that you?
Good.
So good.
So sweet. The acorn bread with the squirrels. So I've known Andria for quite a long time. I teach in the Department of Wildlife, as Gretchen mentioned, and Andria completed her undergraduate degree in the Department of Wildlife at Humboldt State. And she was in one of my first classes of wildlife techniques. Well, we don't have to talk about what year that was, but we were here at about the same time, and it was a while ago. And so we had a lot of fun in that class, and she was an excellent, outstanding student in the program, and went on after graduation to get more experience, as many of our students do, get more field experience, get dirty in the field, and she had great opportunities to work on a few different projects that generally happened to revolve around the Pacific Fisher. And so she was fortunate to get jobs with different agencies and nonprofits and groups to work on a project where they reintroduced fishers to a part of sort of north, central, eastern California. She'll tell you about where that was. And she did some really interesting work watching this reintroduced population establish themselves in this forest, and worked closely with the researchers out there, and really thought that after a few years there were these interesting questions on diet and what were fishers eating. And she called me up, and she was considering graduate school. And so we talked about projects and coming back to Humboldt for graduate school, and that worked out very well. She was well supported by her research group to complete her research, and then she was supported by a scholarship back at HSU for being an outstanding student, and so it really worked out well. And she just recently completed her master's degree in May of 2019, and after that, needed a break and went for a long walk. I don't know, are you going to talk about it, or am I going to steal it?
Yeah, you go ahead.
She walked through Hiker of the Pacific Crest Trail. So she took several months to walk north to south from Canada to Mexico, and she's recently back from that, refreshed. And I wanted to point out also, thank you for the basket contributors, a recipient of the Sequoia Park Zoo Conservation Grant. So this grant, this group was able to provide some funding to help Andria get some equipment for her work. And I think she'll no doubt underestimate the amount of work she put into this project, but there were 80 remote cameras out there for a year that she checked and got hundreds of thousands of photos that she had to go through. There was a lot of work involved, and I'm also proud on behalf of the zoo that we were able to support her. And then we invited her to come back and talk to this community to also thank you for contributing. So it kind of comes full circle. So it's not anymore about me, it's all about Andria. I'm really happy. Let's give Andria a warm up.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Michaela, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm really excited to speak with you. As Michaela mentioned, I was lucky enough to receive a conservation grant from the Sequoia Park Zoo in 2017. So I'm here today to talk to you about how I use that money and to do my research for my project at Humboldt State. So just a little brief overview of what we're talking about today. I'm going to start with a little bit of background, just to let you know some information about fishers and squirrels and how that relates to acorns. And then from that, we'll talk about the questions that I developed and the methods that I used to answer those questions in my research. And then from there, we'll talk about the results of my research and what those results mean. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the management implications of those results. So how can conservationists and managers on the landscape use the results of my study to conserve fishers? So you might not know, but fishers are the coolest animal around. It's just my opinion. They are a mid-sized member of the weasel family, so they're closely related to marten, minks, otters, wolverine. And just like all members of this family, fishers are carnivore. And fishers are solitary throughout their life, except for females with young. So for about 4 months of the year, females will care for their young, but for the remainder of the year, females are solitary, and males are solitary all year except for while they're breeding. And fishers are a forest-dwelling carnivore, so they're found in mid-elevation forests that usually comprised of mixed conifer species as well as some hardwood components, so oaks, alders, maples, that sort of thing. This map shows the range of fishers in North America. They're actually endemic to North America. They're only found here, one of the things I love about them. And this lighter shaded region here shows the fishers' range in North America prior to European settlement. And so this darker range here is where fishers currently exist, and you can see it's been reduced greatly. They're now only inhabiting about 68% of their historical range. If we zoom in a little bit more into where we are, our part of the world here on the West Coast, you get a really good look at how that contraction has occurred. This light gray part, again, is pre-European settlement, and these darker regions represent current populations. And if we look in California, we see there's two disjunct populations that are still existing. This Northern California population and then down here in the Southern Sierra. And here in this region is where the reintroduction occurred that Michaela mentioned. And there's actually been a lot of reintroduction efforts across North America. All of these icons that you see, these circles, squares, and diamonds, all represent a different reintroduction effort that has occurred for fishers. And so again, we see here is that circle of the Northern Sierra Nevada population. You guys might have heard about some of the more recent introductions in Washington. And all throughout this area, wherever fishers occur, they're found in mature forests mostly. They like big trees, they like a closed canopy, and they also like a diverse understory. So that means a mixture of different species as well as a structurally diverse understory where you can picture from the ground to the top of the trees different layers of tree species of differing ages. They also like woody debris, so fallen logs, as well as standing dead trees such as snags. And that's because these woody debris create the structure that fishers need for a large part of their life cycle. They use cavities to give birth to their young as well as to raise their young. They also use cavities and large branches and crevices for resting throughout their life. So that's why these woody debris items and cavities, standing trees, are really important for fishers. Here are just two photos of two maternal fisher dens that I got in the field. So maternal means this is where they gave birth. On the left here, it was a black oak den, and you can see kind of this different layers of the understory. There's some downed wood here. There's several different cavities in this tree. There's cavities in this tree next to it as well. This over here is an incense cedar snag, and you might be able to see the cavities up at the top here where she had her kits. And again, you can see there's a mixture of hardwoods. There's several different conifer species, all creating a multi-layered and diverse understory. And so you might be wondering, what do fishers eat? In most of their range outside of California, fishers are actually specialized to hunt and kill porcupines. They're one of the few animals that do that. They also love a good snowshoe hare, but things are a little bit different here in California. Porcupines are mostly rare or absent in mid-elevation forests here in California, and this is due to a history of lethal removal. Porcupines damage timber products, so timber companies have in the past actively removed them from the landscape to protect their timber products. So those populations are still rebounding from that, and so fishers aren't really coming across porcupines where they live here in California. The same is true for snowshoe hares. Fishers don't really inhabit the same habitat types as snowshoe hares. Snowshoe hares are found at higher elevations in the Sierra Nevada and are found in different vegetative communities as well. So again, fishers aren't really running into these two critters out in the woods here in California. They're more of a generalist predator here. So they're going to eat a more diverse range of items from different groups such as birds, insects, even plant material in some cases. But they still like to try and go for the biggest bang for their buck. They'll try and get the biggest prey item they can find. So in the absence of porcupine and snowshoe hare, that leaves a lot of small mammals such as rodents, right? And There's been some recent work in the Southern Sierras as well in my study area and recently in Southern Oregon to take a closer look at what items fishers are preying on. And so when you collect scat, so here's some fisher scat that's being washed in a lab at North Carolina State University, you have to rinse the scat really well to get the items that are there for classification. And here we see some squirrel claws, and on the right we see squirrel molars. And that's because we found in these scat analyses that fishers really like to eat squirrels. Specifically, here in California, we're finding they really like Douglas squirrels and western gray squirrels. And this is likely because in the absence of animals like porcupines and snowshoe hares, this is the largest bodied prey item available to them in the landscape. And they were two of the most commonly identified prey items in these scat studies that were done. Particularly western gray were the #1 prey item that was identified. So it seems like these are probably important for fishers. And if they are important, they might be influencing where fishers choose to go on the landscape. And so when we as biologists are thinking, what can we do to protect fishers? How can we conserve this species? You might want to think about where squirrels going, because maybe that's where fishers are going to. And that is where acorns and masting hardwoods come in. So hardwoods that produce acorns or masting hardwoods are important for squirrels because acorns are a primary component of squirrels' diet. Especially the western gray squirrel, they will utilize acorns throughout the year. Western Douglas squirrels more so in the summer and fall to build fat stores for winter, but both of these squirrels rely on acorns in their diet. Squirrels also eat a lot of things like fungus, berries, and other plant material, but these fatty acorns are an important component. And in the northern Sierra Nevada, two common hardwoods that you'll find that produce acorns are black oak and tan oak. And these two species differ in their capacity to produce acorns. And this table here is just breaking that down for us. So on the top we have black oak, and a black oak will start to produce acorns dependably at about 80 years of age. In comparison, a tan oak can start to do that as young as 40 years of age. And when these trees are in these age classes, they're pretty close in size. Tan oaks are a bit smaller, but this is the big takeaway here. The average tan oak can produce almost twice as many acorns per tree than a black oak, twice its age and slightly larger. So tan oaks have the ability to potentially provide a lot of good quality fat resource for squirrels. So these trees might be extremely important for squirrels and might dictate where squirrels are going. So again, that reintroduction effort here in the northern Sierra Nevada started in 2009, and it took about 2 years to fully release 40 adult fishers from this part of California down here. And currently, there's about 70 individuals known alive in the population. And so it's a successful reintroduction by all accounts. And this is a really great area to kind of look at this question of tan oak and black oak, because there's a lot of that occurring here in this part of the Sierra Nevada. It's a beautiful area if you haven't been there. It's about 30 miles northeast of Chico, California, in Butte and Tehama counties. It's mid to low elevation, so about 1,500 to 6,000 feet. And the area where I was working and where the fishers were reintroduced was on a large tract of land owned and operated by Sierra Pacific Industries. So these fishers are living on an actively logged landscape. And so this is a really great opportunity to understand how heavily managed landscapes can support fisher populations, and it opened the door to a lot of interesting research. There we go. I was really lucky when I graduated college in 2013 to score a job on this translocation. I was very excited. I got to trap fishers every year, work very closely with them, and then I got to go out every day and find them in the woods, and we put radio collars on them. So it was my job to go and figure out where they were, sometimes walk in and find their den locations. But it was a really great project, and it allowed us to research fishers more closely, see what their behaviors were, where they are going on the landscape, and also keep track of the population as a whole. And while I was working out there, this is the kind of forest that I was expecting to always find fishers in. If you think of an old growth forest, big trees, big logs, closed canopy, that's what we knew as fisher habitat. So I always thought, well, that's where fishers are gonna be. But I often found when I was finding fishers that they were in stands that looked a lot more like this. Skinnier trees, more open canopies, a lot of hardwoods. This is a tan oak stand. This is a tan oak stand here. The downed wood is less big. It's more like, branches than logs, things that you wouldn't think were good fisher habitat. So it kind of got me wondering, why would a fisher come here? And when I was working with Michaela and my graduate committee on developing research ideas, this is something we talked about. And we thought, well, maybe they're going here to forage, because maybe the structures that they use for denning and resting aren't the only thing they need, right? Maybe there's other things in the landscape providing good resources for their prey. And if that's the case, then we should maybe try and look at that a little closer. Are there more squirrels there? And if so, are fishers going there to find squirrels? And so that brings us to the questions that I posed for my research and the methods that I used to answer them. So I asked two major questions. The first of which, do forest stands with a greater capacity to produce acorns support bigger numbers of Douglas squirrel and western gray squirrel? And if you're familiar with wildlife research, measuring populations requires going out, trapping animals, marking them, releasing them again, trapping them again. It's labor intensive, it's costly, and it can be harmful to the animals. Additionally, squirrels are notoriously hard to trap. Especially western gray squirrels, they just don't really like to go in traps. So it can be hard to get direct population size estimates on these animals. But biologists are creative. So we've found a lot of ways to get around these kinds of things in the natural world to answer questions that can be hard to get at. And non-invasive methods are one of those. So using track plates or remote cameras can allow us to measure different things, such as the measured levels of use of an area, as well as our ability to detect an animal. And the patterns in those numbers can reflect the population size that is occurring in that area. So we don't have to directly measure the population to kind of get an idea of what patterns are occurring on the landscape. And so using this non-invasive framework and this question, I posed a first prediction that I believe that stands with a tan oak dominant component would have the highest levels of use and probability of detection of tree squirrels. And when I say tree squirrels, that's just a collective word for Douglas squirrel and western gray. And then my second question was related to the first question. Are fishers using stands with the potentially highest number of tree squirrels? Are they choosing stands specifically because there are more squirrels there? And again, using that non-invasive framework, I posed a second prediction that a stands with a tan oak component would have the highest levels of use and detection of fisher. So, as Michaela mentioned, I surveyed a total of 85 stands. And we did that for a period of 44 weeks over in 2017, so almost the entire year. And when we were trying to decide where to put the cameras, one thing we wanted to be sure of was that the stands we selected should represent what we know to be good fisher habitat. So all of the stands had relatively large trees, generally the same size between stands. And also all of the stands had moderately high canopy closure. So we kind of controlled for that to make sure that all else being equal, what would be different in terms of squirrels. If everything else is equal, what might be affecting fishers using that habitat? And ooh. Sorry. Oh. Hold on. Don't look. Oh my, I don't know what's going on here. Pardon me. It just keeps, it just keeps skipping to the end. I don't know if the button's stuck. Sorry, everyone. All right. Okay, let's try that again. All right, where was I? So they all had these similar forest characteristics. And then we created 3 stand types. So what that means is the first stand type was dominated by a black oak component. So all of these stands are a mixed conifer forest with a hardwood component. And the first type would have a dominance of black oak. So 20–50% of that stand was dominated by a black oak. Then the next stand type, similarly, 20–50% of the trees in that stand were tan oak. And then we created a sort of control set of stands that we called conifer stands. And these are dominated by conifers. They have a small hardwood component of less than 20%. So whatever hardwoods are occurring in there, it's small. and that is meant to be compared to the hardwood stands, and then the two black oak stands the black oak and tan oak can be compared to each other. And so after we picked our sites using some computer software, I went out there in the field. I located a suitable site as close to the center of the stand as I could to you might be able to see the camera here on this tree. And so I would put the camera on the tree and I would point it at another tree close by. That was my bait tree. And I did this so that the ground is visible and both sides of the tree as well as the bait. And this bait here, this is smooth peanut butter that I just smeared on the tree with a stick here. And these are in-shell walnuts that I drilled holes into and strung on a metal wire. It's a lot more labor intensive than you might think. And this was really exciting because there's only been a handful of researchers that have used this kind of bait, and it's usually in conjunction with another bait, so like chicken and some sort of scent lure. This is, as far as me and my committee members know, one of the few times that just peanut butter and nuts have been put out there to get wildlife. And we weren't really sure if we were going to get fishers or not, or how well it was going to work. It was kind of an experiment. And we ended up being really excited and surprised at the number of photos that we are getting. So this is just, these are just the same collection of, this was just 10 minutes of so many photos of fisher kits and fisher moms. So this is a female. You can see her collar there with her 2 kits. They're probably about 4 weeks old in this photo. But what's great about these cameras, you can just set them out there and then you can get series of photographs, and by looking at the photos you can determine the number of visitation events that occur at the camera. You can say a fisher came to this camera this many times and a squirrel came to this camera this many times. And there's some really cool software out there. Reconyx is a remote camera manufacturer, and they have this program that lets you input your photos directly into the program, and it outputs a spreadsheet with associated data for each individual photo. So every line in an Excel spreadsheet becomes a data point. It's associated with a photo, and it has the date and the location. And then, with the help of about 5 volunteers from HSU, we went through each individual photo and added data to each line, saying what we were seeing in the photo, what species was there, how many species, what they were doing. And then for my analysis, it was sort of a 2-part analysis. So we got that data into those spreadsheets, and then I was able to do some statistical digging in there. And so what I was looking at was 2 things, use and detection. I wanted to know the level of use and the probability that a stand was being used either by a squirrel or either of the, a fisher or either of the 2 squirrel species that I was looking at. And then additionally, when you're using cameras, you can get at the rate of detection, which allows you to estimate how well you're detecting the species given that it's there. And detection helps inform use, but it also gives another level, a way to measure use, because an animal that is repeatedly coming to a stand is likely going to be detected more frequently. And additionally, an animal that's moving around in a stand will likely also be detected more frequently. So higher detection kind of implies heavier use. And then the second part of my analysis, I wanted to look more closely at the relationship between fishers and gray squirrels. Gray squirrels are considerably larger than Douglas squirrels, so they're probably better for squirrels as far as better for fishers as far as a meal goes. They get bigger bang for their buck, right, with a bigger animal. And also, they were the #1 item we found in that Fisher scat study. So we think that they're really important. And so I wanted to know, do fishers use stand conditional on a gray squirrel being there? Is a fisher going to a stand because a gray squirrel is there? Are they more likely to go to a stand when a gray squirrel is present than when it's absent? And so I used some confusing statistics to kind of see what was going on with that relationship there. And here are my results. This number, that's how many photos we looked at, over 500,000 photos. It took several months. It was a lot of work, but it was also really fun. It's like Christmas every day when you get to go look at your camera photos. And this table here, these numbers are independent visitation events to the cameras. And the takeaway that I want you to see is for Douglas squirrel, we saw the highest number of visitation events occur in conifer stands. But for gray squirrel and fisher, the greatest number of visitation events occurred in those tan oak stands. And so for that first part of my analysis that I talked about, where I was looking at use and detection, for Douglas squirrel, we saw that they use all the stands a lot. So there's a lot of Douglas squirrel out there. They seem to be using all of the stands relatively equally. The conifer stands maybe just a little bit more. But detection for Douglas squirrels was the highest in conifer stands. And for gray squirrels, we saw that use level was highest in tan oak stands, and detection was also highest in tan oak stands. And the most exciting part was that use levels for Fisher were also highest in tan oak stands, and so were detection rates. So Fisher and Western gray have a similar pattern of use and detection in those tan oak stands. And for the second part of my analysis, where I was seeing, does a gray squirrel need to be in the stand for a Fisher to be there? Well, the answer is no. It's not conditional. Fishers are going to these stands regardless of whether a gray squirrel is there. That's at least the conclusion we came from my data. It wasn't a super fine analysis. We can't say with definitive certainty that they're not doing that, but my data didn't support that they were. However, what we did see that Fishers are using tan oak stands at the greatest rate regardless of whether squirrels are there. So something's going on in that tan oak. In that second part of the analysis, I looked at these different detection outcomes that could occur. So I had 44 survey weeks, and within each of those weeks, these are the different outcomes that could occur. Either neither of these species were there, only the squirrel, only the Fisher, or both. And what was interesting when we looked at that data was that tan oaks were the only stand where we had 0 weeks where neither were present. So that means for the entire 44 weeks of my survey, either a squirrel or a Fisher was always in a tan oak stand. And then tan oak stands also had the greatest number of detection outcomes where both species were present. So again, even though my data didn't say with certainty that there's a conditional use going on between Fishers and Western gray squirrels, we do see that something's going on here, right? The level of use is the highest, the detection is the highest, and it seems like both these species really like to go to tan oak stands. So that comes back around to those questions and the predictions that I posed. My first prediction was that the stands with the tan oak component would have that highest level of use and detection of tree squirrels. And this prediction was not supported for Douglas squirrels because we saw that they had that in the conifer stands. But for gray squirrels, my prediction was supported. They had the highest level of use and detection in these tan oak stands. And what does that mean for my original question? Do these stands that can provide more acorns for squirrels support greater number of Western gray and Douglas squirrels? It doesn't look like that's the case for for Douglas squirrel, right? As I said, they are really focused on pine seeds. They're a conifer cone seed specialist. Acorns are more of a secondary component of their diet. So it looks like there's actually a greater number of squirrels in the conifer stands, which makes sense because that's what they like, is those conifer seeds. And it makes sense that they would have been seen in all of my stands because this is a mixed conifer forest. So it appears that there's an abundance of Douglas squirrels out there in all of these stands. And then for Western gray squirrel, if the detection and the use level that we see does reflect the population size, it appears that tan oak might support the greatest number of Western gray squirrels. And again, that's because of this resource that they can find for acorns, but tan oak are also really important for mycorrhizal fungi, which squirrels love to eat, and other fruiting understory species. So there's a lot of food in tan oak stands for squirrels in general. So I think that it's a combination of this acorns and other diverse food resources that are available for Western gray squirrels there that might be making that happen. And then my second prediction, that stands with the tan oak component would have the highest levels of Fisher use. And this prediction was supported because we did see that the highest levels of use and detection occurred in tan oak for Fisher. And that comes around to my big question, really, do Fishers stand with the potentially greatest number of tree squirrels? So it does appear that there's potentially a bigger number of Western gray squirrels in tan oak stands, but again, my data couldn't say definitively they're going there just for gray squirrels, but it seems like there might be more there. So what I think is there's a possibility that there's a couple different things happening here. The first one might be that Fishers are selecting these stands because there's gray squirrels there. They're going to tan oak stands because there's gray squirrels there because they love those acorns, right? That might be what's going on. It could also be that Fishers are selecting these tan oak stands because they're generally abundant with prey. Acorns are great for all mammals, especially other rodents like rats and mice. And then again, that those relationships and associations with fungi and other understory plants make it a good resource for lots of potential prey items for fishers. So they might be going to tan oak stands because there's lots of prey there, and then they're going to take gray squirrel when it's available to them because it's one of the largest bodied prey that's available for them to consume in that area. Or the third possibility is that they're going to these tan oak stands for completely different reasons. They might not be foraging there. They might just be traveling through them to get to point A, from point A to point B, and taking gray squirrels opportunistically along the way. Unfortunately, my research, we can't know for fact what the fishers are doing in those stands, but they're obviously using them a lot. So it's probably because like I said, of the either abundant prey resources there, or they're moving through the landscape for different reasons and foraging there as they're passing through. And really the reason we do wildlife research is to inform managers, right? So I think that my research has shown that a moderate amount of acorn producing hardwoods on the landscape are important, probably for all wildlife, but especially for fishers on the West Coast. And I would recommend to managers that are, especially private land managers, if they're doing any sort of management plans in their land, to try to retain important hardwoods like tan oak. So one way they could go about doing this would be to spray herbicide sparingly and with careful consideration. When timber is harvested by timber companies, they come through shortly afterwards and spray herbicide to squelch the growth of plants that come up immediately after disturbance. And that's because they create shade, which kills young conifers. And what timber companies want are big conifers. So they come through and they kill all the plants that could potentially stunt the growth of their conifers. And so I would just say, if they're doing that in an area with tan oak, to consider the consequences if they are hoping to conserve fishers. I would also recommend that they retain large mature tan oak trees whenever possible, because these are the trees that are really producing the acorns that are really doing the work. So if managers can keep at least some percentage of these trees when they're doing tree removal, I do think that that would benefit fishers in the long term. And on public lands that aren't necessarily intensively managed, that aren't having trees being removed, what we probably need to think about more is the impacts of drought and fire and how that might impact this relationship of tan oak squirrels and fishers. And drought is not great for tan oak. Tan oak needs moist soil to grow and for seeds to germinate. So without that, there might be mortality in seedling growth. Drought can also reduce acorn production in tan oak and can also affect fungal networks. So it would have these indirect effects on tan oaks, which would maybe change the way acorn production occurs, which could affect squirrel populations and could negatively affect fisher populations. And additionally, fire is a big concern in our forests here in California. And aside from direct mortality, if enough fire happens and if severe enough fires in short enough succession, there can actually be complete replacement of tan oak on the landscape by brush. So that's another thing for managers to keep in mind if they have these disturbances on their landscape, that if the tan oaks are killed, that's a potential resource loss for these squirrels, which again could negatively affect fishers. And then finally, there we go. Managers are using long-term monitoring a lot more commonly. Remote cameras are becoming increasingly popular. And that's because you can just throw stuff out there and get awesome pictures like this. And you can learn a lot about what's going on out there with them. And I've shown that you can use something like peanut butter and nuts to get pictures of a lot of different species. These are ringtails up here. Here's a beautiful gray fox. I also got large carnivores. This deer everything loves peanut butter, so it's pretty easy to get animals to come to peanut butter. But really, I think the most important thing is how well we were able to detect squirrels. We got the western gray, this upside-down dug squirrel here. This is a California ground squirrel. We overlook these things a lot, these smaller critters, when we're talking about carnivores, these charismatic species that we all love and want to conserve. It really does come back to these relationships they have with their prey, with the landscape they're on. So I think that I've shown a way that we can creatively find more information about these little animals that are out in the woods and are so important to the animals that we love. And so with that, I just want to quickly, again, thank the Sequoia Park Zoo so much for providing me with this grant. My research would not have been possible, so thank you to everyone who contributes to that. Also to Sierra Pacific Industries for having me on their land and allowing me to carry out this research. So many different agencies that were a part of this work, as well as my graduate committee and a long list of people that I love and that supported me through my graduate work. And with that, I will take any questions.
Were you able to develop personal relationships with some of the, yes?
The Fishers?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
remember
There were
species
animals,
here.
yeah, there would be animals you catch year to year that you get to hold in hand and see how they grow every year. And then also certain females that you just like, were always really hard to find, and you'd be like, oh, I hate her, or I love her. I really like male fishers. They're like little teddy bears, and there was one in particular that every year when I would catch him, it would just make my heart sing. I love them.
And would you go from one year to the next, and then when he saw you, it was like, oh yeah, here she is?
No, I don't think they liked me as much as I liked them. Yeah, there's the peanut butter girl.
And one other question,
Yeah.
Does Fish and Wildlife give take permits as far as pelts or anything like that?
Not in California. So at least the southern Sierra population is listed as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. Yeah, and they're currently right now being petitioned for listing under the Federally Endangered Species Act as well.
Good.
So when they reintroduce a species like that, do they go 50-50 male-female, or how do they proportion?
Yeah, it's a little bit, I think a little bit more complex than that. I don't remember the exact number, but there were more males to females. Males disperse much further than females, so if you're putting them out there, you're likely to probably lose a few males. They have a higher mortality rate as well to females because they move so much further.
It would go the other way around, but if the females have a higher mortality, you would want to...
No, the males have a higher mortality because they roam so much further, yeah.
So has there been any impact by the cannabis?
Yeah, not so much here in the Northern Sierras. It is a little bit of a problem, but SPI does a really good job of excluding people from their land. But that's definitely a huge issue in the Southern Sierra Nevada mountains, where there's a lot more public land, and that is one of the major reasons why they're petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. At least the West Coast population, yeah. But that's not as big of a problem where we are. They've done some necropsies on fishers, and we haven't found any rodenticide traces yet in our population. Oh, a bunch of hands just went up. I think you were first, all the way in the back there.
I can get a sense of your spatial relation to your cameras. Is there any chance that your fishers are going to several cameras?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't really get into the nitty-gritty details there. My cameras were autocorrelated for fishers. So it wasn't independent animals going to each camera. We spaced them about 500 meters apart minimum to prevent correlation between sites for squirrels. Good question. Yeah?
Is 2017 considered like a heavy masting year for the tan oak, or was it a pretty average crop?
Oh, that's a great question. So I didn't directly measure the amount of mast. Unfortunately, that's not something I was able to do. I would say it was about an average year. 2015 was like the heaviest year that I saw. But that's a really good point. Masting trees do vary in how much mast they produce each year. But tan oak is known to be one of the most dependable species, whereas black oak will maybe do it every 1 to 3 years. Tan oaks typically do produce about the same amount of mast every year.
And was black oak considered low or anything like that in 2017?
Not that I know of, but again, we didn't quantify that. So there is a study, Jenkins did a study on the East Coast where he did directly quantify mast, and he did find that as mast increased, squirrels increased, and so did fishers. So there is evidence of that out there.
Is there any information about reproductive capabilities between the north and the south populations of fishers?
As far as reproducing between each other, right now they're geographically too isolated for that to occur.
Right, so that's not. So was that, though at one time they were able to?
At one time, yes, but there's actually, for a long time thought that the separation between the two populations happened because of human the habitat destruction or hunting, but there's actually evidence that shows that there was genetic divergence between those populations long before Europeans were here, and we don't actually know why that happened. So that's a great question. We don't know if there was connectivity between the populations, what would happen if we started to get mating there. So, yeah.
Did you have to worry about being bitten by the fishers when you're handling them?
They are anesthetized, so they're really drowsy. They're very friendly. They're just kind of woozy and coming up from drugs. So no, I mean, you do have to obviously, always be on alert, but they are usually incapacitated.
And when you have this invite of peanut butter and stuff, had you any problems with animals attacking the fishers while they're eating?
No, it seemed that it was usually if there was multiple animals at the camera at the same time, it was a group like a mother fisher and her kits, or a female gray fox with one of her kits. I didn't really ever see, there was a couple instances of different species there at the same time, but nothing occurred where there was any sort of, there was no interaction that I could see on camera anyway. What happened behind the scenes, I don't know.
One more question.
Yeah.
How does a fisher kill a porcupine?
So they flip them over, very carefully, they flip them over on their back, and they go in through the front where they don't have the quills. Yeah.
How large was the overall study area visited?
The tract of land that's owned by Sierra Pacific is about 650 square kilometers. It's pretty large. And I would say that my cameras ranged throughout most of that. There was a section at the top where I didn't have cameras, but it was a spatially wide study. That's why I had so many cameras that covered through that whole area. Yeah.
So the location where the reintroduction occurred, I was thinking before you said what you said a minute ago that you picked that spot because it might help connect the populations, but it doesn't sound like that's necessarily true. Why was that spot selected?
Sierra Pacific actually approached California Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Service and said we have land that we think would be good for fishers here. And I think they also did it in preparation for the potential listing of the species, because they were able to develop a CCCA, which sort of gives them a little bit of leeway with timber harvest in areas where fishers occur, and because they have fishers on other parts of their landscape as well. So they really were the ones who kind of spearheaded it. They thought that they had quality habitat for fishers. So, yeah.
As the porcupine populations possibly recover, would you ever want to look at if there's any overlap in prey selection and changes as they come back?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have some evidence that there's porcupine out here, but very, very few. But if they did come back, it would be really interesting to see how those scat analyses would change. Did they immediately switch to porcupine, or are they just continually kind of taking opportunistically the squirrels? I think that would be super interesting. Hopefully they do come back. Yeah.
My understanding was that fishers ate a fair amount of fruit and fungi.
So those are kind of hard to identify in scat because they're not left like bone and hair. But yeah, they absolutely do.
Yeah, I hadn't heard you mention that.
Yeah, and that was actually something I thought was interesting when I was learning about squirrels and how much fungi they eat, and then sometimes fishers are eating fungi as well. It's kind of an interesting overlap there, but it's harder to detect those things in scat surveys. There's likely a lot of that going on, and then you can see it in fresh scat.
Their use of these stands.
Absolutely.
Same resources that squirrels are using.
I absolutely think that could be the case. Yeah. I think there's a lot of food for them in those stands. Yeah.
I'm curious about your stand selection. You've mentioned relatively large trees. Can you give us a range of DBH and then canopy closure?
Yeah, I just was, trying to not be too specific, but the average was 28 inches. Or 28 centimeters, excuse me. And then the canopy closure was at least 60%. So those were minimums. So it had to have an average of that. It was a quadratic mean diameter for the trees, and it was an average for the stand. And those stands were 3 hectares in size. Yes?
I don't think you looked at it specifically in your study, but can you talk a little bit about what the hunting strategy of the fishers is to get the squirrels? Are they kind of hiding out and ambushing, or do they see a motion up in the tree and then go get them? And is it mostly night or mostly day?
Well, fishers are actually, they're kind of individualized in their behaviors as far as time of day. We found that they tend to actually be more crepuscular than the previously thought. But as far as hunting strategies, some work that Roger Powell has done tracking fishers in snow, he's found that depending on the animal that they're following, they'll make either direct paths to them or more of a slinking kind of hunting path. And often when I would find fishers resting on a tree branch, I would actually find them in a dray, which is a squirrel nest, like an old squirrel nest. So I think that sometimes they might actually find the squirrel in the nest and kill them there, and then they would eat the squirrel while they were resting, which is really cool. I've actually seen several fishers come down from a branch with a squirrel in their mouth. So I think either they're catching them on the ground and taking them up there, or they're actually finding them in those drays and in the trees. I think both are probably occurring. But Roger Powell has found that they do like a more of a beeline hunt to something like a porcupine and more of an ambling kind of moving through the landscape with smaller prey items.
Are they actually able to hook into the tree and climb up the tree?
Yeah, they sure are. And they actually have a really cool joint in their hind feet so they can turn their feet backwards. So when they're climbing down a tree, it's like behind them, if that makes sense.
They're similar to a squirrel
Mm-hmm.
as far as their ability to...
Yeah, if you ever want to have a fun night, Google like Fisher catching squirrel, and there's really cool YouTube videos of them running up and down trees.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. I like that.
Nice.
And it also looks like, I know it's 88 degrees, but it seems like that tongue would be really good for like getting ants and bugs.
Oh yeah, and you know, you might be able to see he has some peanut butter on his nose. A lot of the photos that I get, they have the animals would have their tongue out, just like a dog when you give it peanut butter. I think that's part of it too. Yeah, exactly. Sticky.
So that's it.
Oh yeah, all the way in the back there.
Do you know what percent of the diet is acorn for gray squirrels? Like how much of their diet is acorn?
I don't know the percentage. I just know that they utilize it throughout the year. It's something that they're taking throughout the year versus other squirrel species that will mostly only collect them for the overwintering for in the spring and fall. Sometimes I've seen like piles of acorns and Douglas squirrel middens before, but I don't know the actual breakdown of that diet. Yeah.
I had a question about detection probability across season.
Sure. Did I see a difference in the seasons? I don't have the figure here, but it varied throughout the year, but there wasn't any one season where we saw higher detection versus another. It was generally varied a little bit, but there wasn't like in the winter time we saw a lot more. We thought that maybe when the leaves fell on oak trees that maybe detection would increase in those oak stands and black oak stands, but we didn't see that happen at all. But I did only do my survey for 1 year. So if we were to survey again for additional year, we might be picking up on some of those seasonal patterns that I could have missed. So definitely possible. Yeah.
Were the walnuts the attraction, or was it everybody going for the peanut butter?
Usually the peanut butter went first, yeah. That would be the first to go. And then, you know, if a bear didn't come and eat them right away, because that was pretty common too, sometimes 12 hours later it was gone. But usually the peanut butter would be gone for the first visit. Whatever animal got there first would eat all of the peanut butter. And then the walnuts, since they were in the shell, that actually helped increase our ability to get pictures because the animal would have to kind of finagle with the shell a little bit and break it open. So those were usually there a little bit longer. But again, peanut butter, free peanut butter, you can't say no. Yeah.
What animal did you least expect to come to the peanut butter?
I got a lot of wild turkeys, which I thought, which was really weird. That was probably my biggest surprise, actually, wild turkeys. They were just like hanging out around there, yeah.
What's the lifespan of a fisher?
In the wild, I think on average they don't live super long. Males again die sooner. I think it's like around 4 to 6 is on average. But we did have a couple females on our population we had an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old female. She sadly passed away that year, so that was the oldest fisher I knew. Yeah.
2 questions really. Do you have any insights or knowledge about fisher interaction with sudden oak death, and also the invasion of fox squirrels and their replacement?
Yeah.
Displacement of gray squirrels.
Yeah, that's a great question. So sudden oak death so far hasn't been a huge problem this far north. It's definitely becoming more of an issue. And I think that would be another thing I could add to that slide, along with drought and fire, that managers should consider how sudden oak death might affect tan oak. I think it would have similar consequences, right? As far as fox squirrels are concerned, I'm not sure what kind of habitats they're really displacing gray squirrels in. I don't know if it's at elevations and forests quite like this, but I would think that yeah, exactly, more like oak woodlands. But I would think that a fisher wouldn't care if you're a fox squirrel or a gray squirrel. You know, you're still tasty.
Yeah, a little smaller.
Yeah, exactly. But still bigger than a Douglas squirrel. So.
Have you been able to visit the one in the Arcade Community Forest?
Oh, there's one in the. No, I haven't seen that one.
The one? Do you think there's only one?
I haven't. But the
I
one.
think we have. I was going to mention. I mean, there are fisher in Arcata for sure. Yeah. I think there may be more than one.
Okay.
Jacoby Creek Forest, we've seen them on cameras there as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually these are such great questions, I wanted to just muse for a minute, if I may,
Please.
About these cameras and these photos and how useful these data are and how you can get more information than you think. So 100,000 photos, which then she and her collaborators agreed to share with another student at Humboldt State who completed her undergraduate honors thesis on looking at the relationship between fishers and gray foxes and whether fishers are displacing gray foxes in their behavior in areas where fishers occur, since they were just reintroduced, and in areas which they don't occur. And so I really kind of wanted to exclaim how great it is to be able to contribute to one project and potentially support, right now 2, but maybe 3 or 4. And I wanted to follow up with one of our other grant recipients who, again, I say you guys, as a community funded John Johnston to do camera work in Ecuador. I need to send you, we just got our first paper published with thanks to the Sequoia Park Zoo for a range expansion for, this is one species, but range expansion for 2 species based on a camera study done in a kind of a part of the world that had not been detected before. So it's really exciting that work that this community can support can have bigger repercussions. So thanks again, and with that, I just want to, there was a lot of great questions. I wanted to thank Andrea for her time and let whoever might need to go release them from here, but if you have additional questions, I'm sure she'll have a few minutes to answer. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.